Beneath the pleasure gardens of ancient Rome, behind vines that drank the blood of kings, there once existed a chamber so secret that no record of it remains. It belonged to Valeria Messalina, the young and beautiful wife of Emperor Claudius, remembered by history as both empress and monster. The senators called her insatiable. The slaves called her divine. But beneath her marble gardens, she built a room where the boundaries between desire and cruelty disappeared. Tonight, we descend into that forgotten place, the hidden chamber of Rome's deadliest woman, to uncover what was done in the shadows and why the empire itself conspired to erase it from memory. In the northern quarter of Rome, beyond the forum's noise and the stench of the Tiber, stretched the Gardens of Lucullus, an estate so vast that it seemed to touch the horizon. Built a century earlier by a general who returned from the east with more treasure than Caesar himself, the gardens were a paradise of fountains, marble pavilions, and whispering trees. To the Romans, it was a symbol of luxury. To Messalina, it became something else, a sanctuary for her hungers and a tomb for her conscience. At the edge of the garden stood a villa draped in ivy and laurel, its floors mosaic with scenes of Venus and Mars. Beneath it, unknown to the court, a narrow stair descended into the earth, 33 steps carved in old volcanic stone. At the bottom lay a door of cedar bound with bronze. Behind it, the air grew heavy, perfumed with myrrh and faint rot. This was the place history would never mention, the hidden chamber. The chamber was small, circular, and silent. Its walls were covered in silk-dyed crimson with imported Tyrian dye, more costly than gold. Lamps burned low along the edges, their smoke curling into the carved ceiling, where figures of nymphs and serpents intertwined. In the center stood a marble dais shaped like an altar, though no god's name was carved upon it. Instead, a single bronze mask rested there, a woman's face, expressionless, with sealed lips. Messalina had it brought from Alexandria, where, she claimed, it once belonged to a priestess buried alive for blasphemy. Servants whispered that the empress spent her nights here in silence, seated before the mask, her hair unbound, her hands trembling in the lamplight. Sometimes she spoke to it. Sometimes she simply watched, as though waiting for it to answer. When dawn came, she would ascend the stairs barefoot, her eyes hollow but shining, as if she had prayed and been heard by something that was not divine. The few who served near the lower halls feared the chamber. They spoke of strange sounds, a rhythm like shallow breathing, the hiss of silk when no wind stirred. One claimed he saw a figure move within the doorway when the empress was away, tall, pale, and crowned with vines. The next day, that slave was transferred to the kitchens, never seen again. In time, Messalina began to spend entire nights below the gardens. Claudius was in Ostia, inspecting the fleet, and Rome's courtiers learned to keep their distance. Above ground, the gardens bloomed with white roses and laurel. Below, a different life unfolded. The chamber became her confessional, not to gods, but to her own forbidden desires. It was said she kept a ledger there, inscribed not with names, but with symbols, serpents, flames, crowns, each marking a man or woman who had entered and never been the same. In the darkness beneath Lucullus' paradise, something in her awoke, not madness, but clarity. Power, she learned, was not held in the throne above, but in the secrets kept below. By the second year of her reign, the Gardens of Lucullus no longer echoed with laughter or music. The fountains still flowed, the nightingales still sang, but those who tended the grounds worked in silence. They had begun to sense what Rome could not see, that beneath their feet, the young empress of the world's greatest empire was feeding an appetite the gods themselves might have feared. Messalina had been born into privilege, yet no lineage could explain her hunger. Beauty was her weapon, but secrecy was her art. In public, she smiled like marble, serene, untouched, devout. In private, within the chamber beneath the gardens, she unmasked herself completely. Her reflection in the bronze mask stared back not as an empress, but as a creature liberated from judgment. There, she was not Claudius's wife, nor Rome's mother, but something older, a priestess of pleasure and power. It began with whispers, invitations cloaked in gifts. Nobles received rare perfumes or rings sealed with the imperial crest, summoning them to the gardens at dusk. Those who obeyed were escorted by silent slaves down the hidden stairway beneath the laurel arch. They returned before dawn pale, shaken, sometimes unable to speak. Others did not return at all. Messalina learned quickly that fear and desire were born of the same flame. She used one to feed the other. Some nights, she ordered her guests to kneel before the bronze mask, demanding they confess their most shameful secrets while she listened in silence. On other nights, she let them believe they were her equals, only to humiliate them in ways that broke the illusion of power. Each act was a study, each humiliation a lesson. The chamber became her stage, and every visitor a character in her dark theater of control. The historian Juvenal would later write that Messalina burned with a harlot's rage, competing even with Rome's prostitutes for lust. But those words were only half true. What she sought was not pleasure in flesh, but dominion over it. When she looked into her victim's eyes and saw fear turn to surrender, she felt herself closer to the gods than any priest in the capital. The chamber beneath the Gardens of Lucullus became a temple to her supremacy. Above, Claudius governed by decree, his mind fixed on the empire's borders. Below, his empress governed by pulse and breath. Servants learned to extinguish the lamps near the lower halls at night, for the air carried strange sounds, moans that became sobs, laughter that broke into silence. One slave claimed the lamps flickered even when no door was open, as if the earth itself inhaled and exhaled beneath the villa. But Messalina's hunger was growing. Each night she sought new faces, new forms of submission. Rome's nobility, driven by ambition or lust, began to circle her like moths around flame. Some believed her favor could raise their fortunes. Others feared that refusal would end their bloodlines. All were wrong, for Messalina craved not loyalty nor pleasure, but the moment a soul fractured under her gaze. In the depths of the Gardens of Lucullus, the chamber pulsed with life. Every sigh, every cry became part of its breath. The Empress was no longer merely Rome's most powerful woman. She had become its appetite, and Rome, unknowingly, had begun to feed her. By the spring of 45 AD, the hidden chamber beneath the Gardens of Lucullus had become more than Messalina's retreat. It was now a theater of metamorphosis, a place where identity itself was a game, and human faces were toys to be remade, erased, or adored. Messalina's hunger had turned ritualistic. She no longer sought the simple thrill of conquest. The pleasure of submission had dulled. She wanted transformation, to see nobility stripped of its name, to make senators crawl as slaves, to make slaves dine as kings. And so began what her attendants, in fearful whispers, called the game of faces. The rules were hers alone. Guests chosen for the night were masked before entering, thin wax molds pressed to their skin, crafted in their likeness. When the chamber lamps were lit, the wax would begin to soften, melting slowly down their faces. To remove it was forbidden. The participants could only watch one another's features dissolve, as if Rome itself were melting into formlessness. Messalina would move among them, barefoot, her hair unbound, touching each mask as though blessing it. "You are all equal here," she would whisper. "You are no one." Her attendants recorded nothing, spoke nothing, and vanished before dawn. The chamber itself began to change. The silk walls were now darker, streaked with smoke and perfumed sweat. The bronze mask upon the altar gleamed faintly under lamplight, its sealed lips reflecting the faces that came and went. Some swore it was no longer lifeless, that its surface seemed to shimmer with expressions too fleeting to name. One night, she invited a young priest from the temple of Jupiter, known for his chastity. He was promised the Empress's blessing. Instead, he found himself seated in the chamber surrounded by veiled figures, each with his own face cast in wax. When the lamps grew hot, the masks began to drip, wax tears sliding down identical cheeks. The priest screamed. Messalina only laughed, touching the molten wax as though it were incense. He was never seen again. Outside, the gardens flourished unnaturally. Laurel and cypress grew thick as if the soil itself drank more than water. Gardeners whispered that the roots reached deep into the tunnels, feeding on what was buried below. No one dared to dig. As her rituals deepened, Messalina's moods shifted. She spoke less to her courtiers and more to the silent mask in her chamber. When asked by a handmaiden why she lingered there so long, she replied softly, "Because it listens without judgment. Because it knows me." The slaves who attended her began to vanish one by one. Some fled Rome entirely, leaving their wages behind. Those who remained moved like shadows through the villa. They had learned that the Empress no longer tolerated witnesses, only participants. By midsummer, rumors had spread through the city that the Empress was conducting forbidden rites. A senator's wife, drunk with envy, whispered to her friends that Messalina held nightly ceremonies to unmake the faces of Rome. Within weeks, the woman disappeared from her home. Her husband claimed she had left for the countryside. Yet the laurel trees near the Empress's villa grew a shade darker that season, their leaves edged in red. The game of faces became the symbol of her power, a secret empire built on humiliation and transformation. Beneath the Gardens of Lucullus, Messalina had found the ultimate truth of tyranny, that the greatest power is not in taking life, but in reshaping identity until the victim no longer remembers their own name. By the time the year turned, whispers of Messalina's games had spread beyond the gardens. The senators no longer laughed at the tailies. They lowered their eyes and spoke of business. One among them, Gaius Calpurnius, a man known for both his pride and his devotion to his young wife, dared to resist her summons. When the Empress's messenger delivered an invitation sealed with gold, Calpurnius returned it unopened. That single gesture would destroy him. Messalina had never tolerated denial. To her, rejection was not an insult, it was defiance of divine will. In the chamber beneath the Gardens of Lucullus, she waited 3 nights, silent, her attendants afraid to breathe. When the 3rd night ended, she rose and ordered her steward to bring her a gift worthy of remembrance. Before the next moon, Calpurnius's wife, Alia, vanished from her home. Her attendants claimed she had gone to visit a relative in Tibur, but Messalina's servants were seen carrying a veiled figure through the garden gate at dusk, her ankles bare, her wrists bound in silk. When the chamber lamps were lit that night, witnesses said the air felt heavy, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Messalina stood before her altar, dressed in white, her hair woven with laurel leaves. On the dais lay Alia, alive, trembling, her eyes wide with disbelief. Messalina leaned close and whispered something no one dared repeat. Then the attendants lifted a cup to her lips, thick with poppy wine. By the time the guests arrived, nobles, generals, courtiers who dared not refuse, Alia's eyes had dimmed, her body swaying like a puppet in silk. Messalina called her the Bride of Silence. Music began to play, low and mournful. She commanded her guests to toast the bride's beauty, to speak her virtues, to kiss her cold hands. None disobeyed. Calpurnius himself was forced to attend. He arrived in shock, unaware of what awaited. When he entered the chamber, the lamps flickered and the scent of wine and myrrh choked the air. Before him stood his wife, pale and unmoving, her head crowned with roses. Messalina took his hand and pressed it against the bride's cheek. "See," she murmured, "how Rome honors fidelity." Something inside him broke. The senator knelt, trembling, unable to breathe. The guests avoided his eyes. Messalina, with a faint smile, turned the cup upside down. Red wine spilled across the marble, running into the cracks like blood. At dawn, Calpurnius was gone. His villa was seized, his servants scattered. His wife's body was never seen again. Yet weeks later, the gardeners of Lucullus found a patch of earth near the laurel grove that would not bear flowers no matter how they tended it. The soil there smelled faintly of perfume. From that night forward, the chamber changed. Messalina forbade music during her gatherings. The laughter ceased. Even her attendants began to weep in silence. For the first time, she seemed haunted by something she could not name. Some said she dreamed of the bride, standing among the laurels, her veil fluttering in the dark wind. Others claimed they heard soft singing beneath the earth, a lullaby that rose from the sealed chamber each night before dawn. The empress who once sought power through pleasure had now crossed into something darker. The games had ended. Ritual had begun. And the Gardens of Lucullus, once Rome's jewel, had become a garden of ghosts. The Gardens of Lucullus were once the pride of Rome, terraces heavy with jasmine, marble fountains whispering beside cypress trees, nightingales nesting in the myrtle. But after the night of the dead bride, the air itself changed. The flowers wilted without reason. The fountains turned murky. The gardeners spoke of roots that bled when cut. And Messalina, the mistress of this paradise, began to vanish into solitude. Each dawn she walked barefoot among the withered vines, the dew staining her feet like tears. The courtiers no longer followed her. Even the servants kept their distance. They said she spoke to the earth, asking it to forget. Yet the garden remembered. Lucullus's old banquet hall, once echoing with the music of Rome's elite, now served as her sanctuary of penance. Here, she commanded that every trace of laughter, every song that once celebrated her pleasures, be erased. Musicians were sent away. Dancers disappeared. The air smelled of burnt roses and incense. But Messalina's remorse, if it was remorse, took a cruel form. She began inviting the widows and wives of men she had destroyed, the forgotten women of Rome's political graves. Cloaked in black, they arrived trembling, unsure if it was mercy or mockery that summoned them. At the first gathering, 10 women sat in silence before her. Their faces were veiled, their bodies frail. Messalina stood at the head of the hall, pale and sleepless. "We are bound," she said softly, "by the same husband, Rome." Her voice echoed against the walls, hollow and sharp. Then she ordered the attendants to bring urns, small clay vessels filled with ash. Each urn bore a senator's name. "Their words built your prisons," she told the widows. "Tonight they return to dust." One by one, she scattered the ashes across the marble floor. The women wept, but Messalina's eyes were dry. "Now," she whispered, "breathe." And as they inhaled the dust of their lost men, a strange calm fell over the hall. For a moment, the widows seemed almost free. But freedom in Messalina's world came only through corruption. In the nights that followed, she turned these gatherings into rites, not of mourning, but of unmaking. The women were dressed in crimson, their faces painted pale, their silence demanded. They learned to stand beside the empress like shadows, neither alive nor dead. Soon, senators began to fear their own wives, whispering that Messalina had turned them into instruments of vengeance. Husbands disappeared. Fortunes shifted quietly into her control. The empress, once driven by lust, now found ecstasy in ruin itself. One morning, smoke was seen rising from the lower terrace. The gardeners rushed to find the grove ablaze, a fire burning too hot, too bright for any natural cause. When the flames died, the ashes formed a shape upon the ground, a ring like the mark of a crown. Messalina watched from her balcony, unmoving. "Every root must burn," she murmured, "before Rome can forget." That night, she returned to the chamber beneath the garden, the same place where Aaliyah, the dead bride, had last breathed. Witnesses claimed the marble walls were streaked with soot, and a faint scent of jasmine lingered among the ashes. When she emerged at dawn, her hair was unbound, her eyes distant. "The garden sleeps," she told her attendants. But the slaves swore they heard a different sound from below, a faint crackling like embers that refused to die. In Rome's heart, where beauty once flourished, only ashes remained. And within those ashes, something began to whisper again. By the spring of that cursed year, the Gardens of Lucullus had become a place Romans only spoke of in whispers. The music that once drifted over the terraces was gone, replaced by the faint hum of insects feeding on decay. And yet, at night, torches flickered among the cypresses, and shadows moved where no living guests were known to dwell. It was said that Messalina, unable to bear her nightmares, sought to drown them in ritual. She ordered her slaves to exhume the bodies of courtesans, slaves, and nameless women buried beyond the city walls. They were brought to the chamber beneath the gardens, washed in wine, adorned with jewels, and arranged as if awaiting a feast. The empress called them her silent guests. The first of these gatherings was not attended by Rome's nobles, only by Messalina's most trusted attendants, and a handful of sycophants too afraid to refuse her. When the lamps were lit, the chamber glowed like a catacomb of gold and flesh. The air was heavy with incense and rot. Messalina entered dressed entirely in black silk, her face veiled, carrying a bowl of crushed myrrh. She circled the dead in silence, scattering the resin upon their limbs, whispering verses no one could understand. Then she sat among them, as if they were her equals, and began to drink. The courtiers followed, trembling, the taste of the wine thick and metallic. What began as a grotesque ceremony soon descended into delirium. Some claimed the fumes of decay caused hallucinations. Others swore they saw the corpses move, their lips twitching in mock laughter. The empress rose, her veil slipping, revealing eyes bright with fever. "Rome forgets too easily," she said. "Let them eat with us, the ones our power devoured." As the night deepened, the chamber became a theater of the damned. The living and the dead mingled in a frenzy of madness, hands clutching goblets, mouths pressed to marble-cold flesh, laughter breaking into screams. Messalina herself stood upon the altar, holding a lamp over her head, its flame guttering as she cried, "Life and death, one feast." When the dawn came, silence returned. The torches had burned out. The chamber floor was slick with spilled wine and wilted flowers. Many of the attendants were gone, fled or vanished entirely. Those who remained were forbidden to speak of what they had seen. The chamber doors were sealed for 7 days. When Messalina re-emerged, her face was calm, almost serene. She spoke of purification, of feeding the forgotten. "They are loyal," she told her steward. "They will never betray me." Yet her eyes wandered toward the earth, as if expecting the soil itself to answer. The slaves who cleaned the chamber afterward claimed that when they lifted the bodies, the flesh fell apart like wet clay. Beneath the stone altar, they found something new, a carving of a wreath encircling a skull. No artist admitted to making it. From that night forward, even the bravest senators refused to visit the gardens. Rumors spread through Rome, of screams beneath the ground, of music played by unseen hands, of lamps that burned long after the chamber was locked. The empress, they said, had opened a gate that could not be closed. The Gardens of Lucullus, once a monument to beauty, had become a realm of the dead, and the mistress who ruled it was no longer Rome's courtesan queen, but its high priestess of decay. His name was Turo, a household slave born within the walls of the Gardens of Lucullus, a silent shadow who cleaned the halls and fetched the empress's wine. No one noticed him. No one ever did. Yet it was Tyro who would become the last witness to the horrors that unfolded beneath those marble terraces. After the orgy of the dead, many of Messalina's attendants vanished. The chamber doors remained sealed, but Tyro was summoned each morning to sweep the corridors above it, where the scent of myrrh and decay seeped through the cracks like breath from the underworld. He began to hear sounds faint, rhythmic, like the beating of a pulse beneath stone. At first, he thought it was the shifting of pipes or the murmur of servants. But one night, as he lingered too long in the hall, he heard something else, a woman's whisper, slow and mournful, echoing from below. When he pressed his ear to the floor, he could almost make out words, "Remember me." Days later, the Empress summoned him herself. She was changed, thinner, her once golden hair darkened by neglect, her fingers stained with ash. "You will tend the chamber," she told him. "No one else may enter. The dead prefer your silence." That night, Tiro descended the narrow staircase, carrying only a lamp. What he saw beneath the earth froze his soul. The chamber had become a necropolis. The air shimmered with oil smoke. Bodies, some embalmed, some fresh, lay entwined in grotesque harmony along the marble floor. On the central altar rested a crown of laurel, blackened by soot, beside an open book filled with names written in blood. Messalina stood beside it, her bare feet streaked with wax, her eyes distant. "Do not fear them," she said softly. "They listen." Then she turned her back and began to hum a tune, the same melody the gardeners once heard beneath the soil after the dead bride was buried. Tiro obeyed her commands without question. He poured wine into the silver basins, polished the mirrors, and scattered petals over bodies that no longer smelled of life. But each night, when he left, he heard the whispers grow louder, not one voice now, but many. They spoke of hunger, of betrayal, of vengeance waiting patiently in the dark. One evening, while cleaning near the altar, he noticed something new, a pool of liquid seeping from the cracks in the marble, not wine, but blood still warm. He turned to flee, but the Empress was behind him, her expression unreadable. "Do you hear them too?" she asked. "They ask for justice." He wanted to scream, but her hand was on his face, cold and trembling. "You will remember," she whispered. "You will tell Rome what it made of me." By the next morning, the chamber was locked again. Tiro was dismissed from the household with no reason given. He wandered Rome's alleys for weeks, sleepless, haunted by the sound of unseen voices calling from the earth. Years later, when Messalina's name was erased from marble and history tried to bury her sins, Tiro told his story to a scribe in the Temple of Concord. His account was dismissed as madness, the fevered memory of a slave. Yet when the temple was excavated centuries later, a single parchment was found sealed beneath the floor, stained with red, the handwriting uneven, trembling. The last line read, "The dead still sing in the gardens," and the laurel never grew again. In the autumn of 48 AD, the streets of Rome were lined with garlands and banners. Emperor Claudius was returning from his campaign in Britannia, a triumph meant to restore the city's pride and his own authority. Trumpets blared, senators bowed, and the crowds cheered. But behind their smiles lay fear. For while the emperor was away, his palace had turned into a whispering tomb. The Gardens of Lucullus, once the symbol of Rome's pleasure and refinement, now stood eerily silent. The air around the villa was colder, the soil darker. Servants refused to enter after sunset. Even the birds avoided its terraces. Messalina awaited her husband's return, not with excitement, but with dread. Her beauty had faded into something ghostly, her once vibrant eyes now hollow, her hands trembling beneath jeweled rings that no longer fit. Yet she prepared a feast in his honor, one final performance of the Empress Rome still believed her to be. The great banquet was held in the same gardens where laughter had died months before. Claudius entered beneath golden arches, surrounded by soldiers and courtiers, his triumphal crown still damp with rain. When he saw his wife, he smiled faintly, the smile of a man too weary to suspect. The tables glittered with silver, honeyed figs, roasted game, and amphorae of dark wine. But the emperor noticed something unsettling. The servants who poured his cup did not look up. Their faces were pale, their movements mechanical. And beneath the scent of perfume lingered another smell, faint but unmistakable, decay. Messalina raised her goblet. "Rome feasts tonight," she declared, her voice smooth but strained. "For the living and the dead who built its glory." Claudius frowned. "The dead?" She smiled thinly. "They dine with us always, my lord." The musicians began to play, their fingers trembling on the strings. The guests forced laughter, eager to mask their unease. Yet as the meal continued, a strange chill swept through the air. The lamps flickered. The wine in the emperor's cup darkened, as if shadowed by unseen movement. Then came the final course, covered dishes carried by veiled servants. When the lids were lifted, the guests recoiled. The platters were filled not with food, but with funeral wreaths, laurel crowns, and ashes arranged in the shape of faces. Messalina stood. "Rome devours itself," she said softly, "and calls it triumph." Claudius's hand trembled. "Enough," he muttered. "This is madness." But she continued, her voice rising. "You call yourself conqueror, yet your empire rots beneath your feet. I have only made visible what you built, the feast of the forgotten." The crowd scattered in horror. The musicians dropped their instruments and fled. The emperor stared at her, pale and speechless, as the torches sputtered out one by one. That night, Claudius ordered the praetorians to search the chamber beneath the gardens. When the soldiers returned, they brought with them the stench of death and a single laurel crown, blackened by smoke. The emperor said nothing. He turned away, his face ashen. Before dawn, Rome knew. The Senate met in secrecy. Orders were drafted. The empress would be silenced, not by scandal, but by erasure. The feast of the emperor's return became Rome's last celebration of Messalina's reign. By sunset, the gardens were surrounded by soldiers. And beneath the cypress trees, the woman who once ruled through pleasure waited calmly, her lips curved in a knowing smile, as if she had expected this all along. When the emperor's order came at dawn, the Praetorian Guard marched into the Gardens of Lucullus with torches and spades. Their commander, Caius Livius, had served in Germania and feared no man. Yet as he crossed the garden gates, he confessed later that the air felt wrong, thick with something unseen. Messalina was nowhere to be found. Her chambers were empty, her jewels scattered across the floor, as if she had fled in haste or left her life behind deliberately. The guards split into groups. One searched the villa, another the terraces, and a third, led by Livius himself, descended toward the sealed door at the edge of the laurel grove. The marble threshold bore faint burn marks, and the hinges had been fused with wax. It took 3 men to pry them open. A gust of air escaped, heavy with rotten perfume. The torches flickered as though struggling to breathe. The staircase led down into silence. With each step, the temperature dropped. The walls glistened with moisture. Faint carvings of serpents and laurels ran along the stone. The deeper they went, the more the smell thickened, until one man vomited and begged to return. Livius refused. "We go on," he said. "The emperor commands." At the bottom lay a vast chamber, its ceiling low, its marble floor veined with black. The soldiers froze. Before them stood an altar of polished stone, and upon it, the blackened laurel crown. Around the walls were seated figures, dozens of them, dressed in faded silks, jeweled and still, as if caught mid-feast. Only when the nearest torchlight touched their faces did the truth emerge. They were not statues. They were corpses, preserved by oil and salt, arranged as though waiting for their mistress to return. Among them, one body sat apart, crowned with roses long turned to dust. A single label, carved into the wall behind her, read Domina. "The dead bride," whispered a soldier. His voice echoed, trembling. Livius advanced toward the altar. Beside the crown lay a parchment, stiff with dried blood. The words, faint but legible, read, "Rome is the feast. We are its offerings." Then the ground shuddered. A soft crack, like breath escaping the earth, rippled through the chamber. One of the corpses toppled forward, its jaw opening in a silent gasp. Panic broke the ranks. The men fled toward the stairway, tripping over the dead, dropping torches that hissed against the damp stone. When they reached the surface, the dawn had turned the sky a colorless gray. The commander ordered the entrance sealed again with stone and molten lead. No one spoke of what they saw, not to the Senate, not to the emperor. By midday, word came. Messalina had been found in a nearby vineyard, barefoot, her gown torn, her eyes open but unseeing. When questioned, she spoke only a single sentence, over and over. "They are still hungry." Before sunset, the order of execution was signed. The empress who had ruled through pleasure, who had feasted with the dead, was struck down quietly in a private garden. Her body was never displayed. That night, the Gardens of Lucullus were set ablaze by imperial command. The flames consumed the terraces, the fountains, the cypress groves, but not the ground beneath. For even as the fire raged, the slaves swore they heard music beneath the earth, faint, rhythmic like a heartbeat under stone. Rome turned its eyes away. The chamber was forgotten. The ashes cooled. But the soil never grew laurel again. Night had fallen over the Gardens of Lucullus, but the fountains no longer sang. Messalina ran through the dark terraces barefoot, her silk gown torn, the laurel crown still tangled in her hair. The cries of the soldiers echoed from the streets of Rome above. Her empire had turned against her. Once the mistress of emperors, she was now a hunted shadow. She stumbled beside the pool where the secret chamber once stood. The marble was cold beneath her palms, slick with the dew of night. "They cannot take Rome from me," she whispered, her voice breaking. It was mine before they even saw it. But her reflection in the black water offered no answer, only the hollow outline of a woman devoured by her own creation. The gates of the garden burst open. 2 men entered, the freedman Evotus and the centurion Caesarius, sent by Narcissus with one command: end her life before the emperor changed his mind. They found her kneeling beside the laurel tree, trembling, her eyes wide not with rage, but disbelief. "Do not fear," she said, clutching the laurel crown to her chest. "Tell Claudius I will not beg. I am still his wife." Evotus hesitated. He had seen her once at the feast of the emperor's return, glowing like a goddess, commanding Rome's hunger. Now she looked like a ghost already fading. "Lady," he whispered, "it is too late." She closed her eyes, lifted the crown to her lips, and pressed it there as though kissing the empire goodbye. The sword entered quietly, a sound no louder than a breath. Her blood spread across the white marble like a crimson halo. When she fell, the laurel crown rolled into the pool, floating briefly before sinking beneath the surface. The men left in silence. Behind them, the garden stood still, no wind, no movement, as if the very air mourned. At dawn, the slaves came to cleanse the ground. They found that every laurel leaf in the grove had turned dark overnight, their edges curled as though touched by fire. Years later, under Nero's reign, builders came to restore the gardens. Beneath the soil, they uncovered a hidden chamber, its walls blackened, the mosaics broken but intact. In its center lay the remains of a laurel wreath, petrified by time. When they touched it, a faint voice was said to echo through the air, not words, only a sigh, like silk tearing in the dark. The workers fled, swearing they heard a woman's whisper beneath the stone. "I am still his wife." The site was sealed again, buried beneath new marble, as all Rome's sins were. Yet the laurel grove never grew back. The earth refused it. Scholars would later claim that Messalina's death marked the end of an age, the last moment when pleasure still dared to challenge power. History remembers Messalina as a harlot, a traitor, a warning carved into scandal. But the truth lies buried in the gardens she built, where beauty met horror and power met love. Beneath the dead laurels of Lucullus, her voice endures in silence, reminding Rome that every empire must one day kneel before the ghosts it creates.